read this paragraph for now. The draft response, this is a draft response to a request for a meeting from Sir Alan Bates. The draft response declined the suggested meeting. The reason given for this refusal in the letter was that the Horizon system was an operational matter for Post Office, which was an arm's length body. That accorded with my understanding of the relationship between the government and Post Office at the time. It was not my role as a minister to intervene in Post Office's day-to-day operations. I understood this to be the case for practical reasons. Ministers did not get involved in the day-to-day running of the business. That made sense to me. I was not qualified to and would not have had time to get involved in the day-to-day running of the Post Office. So looking at all of that evidence together, in order to fulfil your role as minister and ensure that the government's strategy for Post Office was implemented, did you not need to have an understanding of the operational issues that were affecting the Post Office?
Not in terms of staff buildings and IT systems, no. The key issue in our manifesto and then in the coalition agreement was to avoid further closures of post offices and to maintain the network. And our focus was on doing that, as I think I described in my statement, was both asking Post Office Limited and Royal Mail Group to come up with a strategy to put to government so we could ask Treasury for subsidy for the rest of the Parliament to implement that commercial strategy. Plus, we were looking at a strategic level, how the Post Office's role might need to change given the changes in the way government put business through the Post Office, the declining footfall in post offices and the changing nature of the high street. So I came to this position wanting to implement our policy, which was at a very strategic level. And it frankly didn't occur to me that I needed to go down into IT systems.
How did you distinguish between what was an operational matter, which was for the Post Office, and matters of strategic policy that were for you?
I guess it was a combination of advice from officials, which they were experienced in this. They had understood and worked with the Post Office and Royal Mail Group for I presume, for some time, and therefore understood that line. But there was also the common sense line, both as I understand now in law and in terms of practical considerations. A minister who has got huge responsibilities over many areas really can't get involved in day-to-day operational matters. And I felt our focus was on the strategic level, where government could make a difference, both in terms of deciding subsidy levels and deciding the ultimate strategic role that the Post Office would play in our society.
What would it take for a matter to reach the level of, quote, strategic policy?
Well, if it was going to fundamentally change the nature of the Post Office and how it supported the public, it clearly has a very big social purpose in many of our villages, towns and cities. And having in opposition and as an MP over a number of years had to fight closures of post offices in my constituency as her colleagues, and having seen how the public valued their post offices and valued their sub-postmasters, it seemed to me that we wanted to make sure those closures didn't happen again, and we were therefore focused on the strategy to make sure that didn't happen again, which, as I've referred to, meant things like subsidy levels, the role of the post office in the future, not day-to-day operations.
Who made it clear to you that it was not for you to become involved in operational matters?
Well, I guess it was the briefing of officials, and you will have seen a number of letters that have been put to the inquiry, that is what I was advised and that is what I understood. It seemed to me...
principally from SHEX?
Yeah, I suppose so. I mean, whoever wrote the letters, I assume it's from Shex, yeah.
Was that made clear to you early in your tenure as minister, that you were not to become involved in operational matters?
Whether it was explicitly in a verbal briefing, I don't think so, but it was in the paperwork that there was this difference. Indeed, I think there's reference to an Act of Parliament in 2001, which said that ministers weren't to get involved in day-to-day operations of either Royal Mail Group or its subsidiaries Post Office Limited, and that these were arm's-length bodies to not to be interfered with on a day-to-day basis. That seemed to make sense to me in common sense terms, that we just wouldn't have had the time or the knowledge to do that. There was so many other things that we were responsible for, and indeed within Post Office, so many other things we were trying to achieve at the strategic level.
Did the same division or prohibition apply to officials within SHEX, i.e. they were not to get involved in the operational matters concerning the post office?
I assume it did, but we didn't have a conversation to that, but I always assumed that was the case.
Did the same prohibition, to your understanding, apply to civil servants outside of SHEX, that they were not to become involved in the day-to-day operational running of the post office?
Yes, it follows that it did. I mean, given that law, I think it was a 2001 Act, it seemed to suggest that government, be they ministers or officials, were to leave Post Office Limited and Royal Mail Group to get on with that day-to-day operational responsibility that they'd been given.
That's something that you suggest in your witness statement. No need to turn it up. It's paragraph 26 on page 7. You say, under the law, Royal Mail Group and Post Office operated at arm's length to ministers. Which law was it?
I think, and I'm sorry, I'm not don't the exact reference. I think it's the Postal Service Act 2001.
You understood the Postal Services Act 2001 to require the government to operate at arm's length to the Post Office and Royal Mail Group?
Yeah, I think that was a reference that we put in a number of letters that I was were drafted for me to sign, and that was the basis as I understood it.
Did you ever receive a briefing on what the Postal Services Act in fact said as to this issue?
No.
And did you ever look at the Postal Services Act to see what the legal relationship between government and Royal Mail Group and Post Office was?
No, and there was probably a good reason for that, Mr. Beer. We were charged through the coalition agreement. I was charged with putting a new Postal Services Act into place rapidly. The government business managers wanted that bill to be ready for a second reading in the autumn following the May election. And my task, which took a considerable amount of my time in those first few weeks and months, was to prepare the Postal Services Bill, which was going to fundamentally change the relationship. So all my time was focused on that, not looking back to an Act of 2001.
You said in your witness statement that you were not aware that the Post Office or Royal Mail Group themselves investigated, prosecuted, and obtained convictions against sub-postmasters. When did you first become aware of that operation or conduct by RMG or POL?
I'm trying to think if it was during this inquiry procedure. I think it probably was. I certainly didn't realise it when I was a minister.
Does it follow that you were unaware of any steps that government took to superintend or oversee the conduct of prosecutions by the Post Office?
I was unaware of those, if there were any at all.
You're aware, I think, that the Attorney General oversees the conduct and operation of the Crown Prosecution Service and answers for the Crown Prosecution Service's performance and conduct in Parliament.
Yes, sir.
Does it follow that you were unaware at the time, the duration of your period as Minister for 20 months, whether or not there was any equivalent position occupied by a member of government in relation to post offices prosecutions and Royal Mail Group's prosecutions, because you didn't know that they were being undertaken by those companies?
That's the case, yes.
But you tell us in your witness statement, and you told us today, that you relied significantly on briefings and the provision of drafts of letters and of submissions from civil servants. Were they principally from within the shareholder executive?
I think they were. Certainly in relation to this issue, the only submissions I've seen was from Mike Whitehead from Shacks.
The 5th of October one?
Yeah, but I will receive many, many more submissions on Royal Mail and Post Office Limited over my time, because there were many, many other issues occurring. And I can't be sure because I haven't gone back to those papers, but they were almost certainly came from Shacks.
To what extent did you monitor SHEX's oversight of the Post Office?
Not sure if monitoring, I mean, we were trying to implement our policy. That was the main focus, the strategic changes we were trying to make. And my interactions with Shacks about that were, again, at that quite high level. I guess for the Postal Services bill, there would have been people outside Shacks within the department, because there would have been the policy committee, the bill committee, because it was quite a big piece of legislation which we were putting together quite rapidly. There would have been a lot of people working on that. So it wouldn't have been exclusively Shacks. And I guess the monitoring of Shacks was through the work we were doing with them, not from their oversight of Royal Mail Group or Poll.
Does it follow that you would treat SHEX as a self-sustaining and self-governing body that would be left to its own devices to monitor and oversee the Post Office in its capacity as shareholder, and that you wouldn't yourself exercise any oversight or control of SHEX itself?
Well, certainly I relied on the advice and experience of SHEX officials who were having a regular dialogue, it seemed to me, with the senior management in Royal Mail Group and in Post Office Limited. As is clear from my statement, I would meet myself those senior managers and obviously just discuss our strategy with them. So I relied mostly on Shacks to do that, but as a minister, I wanted to meet the managers too and put my questions to them. But again, for those meetings, I was heavily reliant on Shacks.
If we turn up page 22 of your witness statement, please. Excuse me, at paragraph 91. You say it's worth emphasising at the outset that whilst it is now clear that there were disastrous problems with Horizon and with the Post Office's conduct towards sub-postmasters, which are now rightly the focus of this public inquiry, that was not at all clear at the time. I was responsible for a large number of important issues across a very broad portfolio, and with respect to all the issues I dealt with in postal affairs, the Horizon issue was one amongst many. And indeed, I was continually advised it was a matter for the Post Office because it was a day-to-day operational issue. Who continually advised you that Horizon integrity issues were operational matters for the Post Office?
Well, that was both in the submission of Mr. Whitehead, but in the drafting of the letters in response to letters from MPs and indeed parliamentary questions. So For example, there were 3 parliamentary questions, written questions. There were no oral questions. There were 3 parliamentary questions, or 3 MPs who asked parliamentary questions. There was probably some of them asked more than one. And the answers to those questions drafted by officials for me to agree to was those issues were matters for the Post Office, and so we referred answering those questions to the Post Office, with their answers being put in the House of Commons library.
Okay.
So that was an example of how that happened.
So you pointed to 2 things constituting the advice, namely the drafts of letters that you were supplied with and the drafts of answers to parliamentary questions.
And indeed the submission of Mr. Whitehead. But this wasn't, the Horizon issue wasn't an issue that we discussed very much, but the advice came through in those matters, yes.
Did you question that advice at all at the time that you received it?
No, because it seemed to be reasonable, and there was a reference to an Act of Parliament. And I thought they were telling me the truth, which, to my knowledge, they were referring to an Act of Parliament, so I assumed that was the truth.
Are you saying that in the submission, the letters or the answers to the PQs, they referred to an Act of Parliament?
In what some of the letters, I don't know how many they did, not in the, I don't think in the parliamentary answers. They may have done. I'll have to check that, Mr. Beer.
Okay, we're going to come to, in fact, there were 4 PQs, not 3, and we'll come to those.
There were 3 MPs and 4 PQs.
Yes, exactly. I think Priti Patel asked either 2 or 3 questions.
Yeah.
Do you accept that the Post Office's role as an active private prosecutor should not have been treated as an operational matter?
If I'd known about it and we'd had a discussion about it, I'd have been surprised.
Why would you have been surprised that the Post Office was prosecuting?
Seems quite an old-fashioned thing. I mean, certainly now, with the benefit of the knowledge of what we know, it was wrong. And as I say in my statement, it seems that power should be taken away from them. But nevertheless, I wasn't aware of it, and it seems odd that they were.
Why would it seem odd that they prosecuted?
Because I think you should have a more thorough process where there's a more independent aspect that goes to the court. That happens in other prosecutions.
Are you referring there to prosecution or criminal offences that are alleged being investigated by independent police forces and then prosecutions in some circumstances being commenced and pursued by the Crown Prosecution Service?
Yes, yes.
So if you had been aware of the conduct of prosecutions by the Post Office, you would have raised a question as to why they were doing it and whether it should continue?
Yeah, I think it's the sort of thing that I would have questioned. Maybe I would have accepted the answers, but it came as a surprise to me when I learnt about it through this inquiry.
You say that you may have accepted the answers, i.e. that it was appropriate for the Post Office to continue to prosecute its sub-postmasters. If that had been your position, would you have said anything about government or ministerial oversight of such prosecutions?
Well, I mean, you're asking me, Mr. Beer, to speculate what I might have done if something had been put to me 14 years ago, and it's quite difficult to do that. I really don't know, to be honest. It was not put to me, and speculating what I might have done 14 years ago is quite tricky.
Can we look at paragraph 92, please, of this witness statement? In the 3rd line, you say, as I've stated publicly, I believe I was seriously misled by the Post Office. I do not know if one or more civil servants misled me during my time as a minister, or if they were themselves misled by Post Office. Can you see that?
Yes, I do.
More broadly in your witness statement, the references are paragraphs 4, 5, 116, 131, 138 and 153, you refer to being lied to by the Post Office.
Yes, I now know was being lied to. I've followed this inquiry, and it's pretty clear what they told my officials was not true.
You refer in paragraph 138 of your witness statement to the individuals within Post Office who lied to you as being senior executives. Are you able to help us as to the identity of the senior executives who lied to you?
Well, the senior executives I dealt with, and this is not directly answering your question, Mr. Beer, but the senior executives I dealt with were David Smith and then Paula Venables. There may have been one or two others, they're the names that I recall. And they were the ones giving the information to my officials, came in their names, and to me. So they were the people passing information which was untrue.
To accuse somebody of lying is to accuse them of saying something that they knew or believed not to be true, with the intention to deceive. Do you agree?
It is, and I'm trying to answer the question because I cannot know what was in their minds and how the information came to them. But someone, I assume, senior in Post Office Limited must have known the truth, must have at some stage understood that. And this is what I hope the inquiry will uncover. It's difficult for me to uncover. I didn't know it at the time, of course. What's emerged from your questioning and from this inquiry and the reports of this inquiry is that there was knowledge of the Horizon system having serious flaws in it within the Post Office Limited, and that was not put forward to ministers, either myself or others.
It's just the cumulative effect of what you suggest in the paragraphs that I've listed tends to suggest that you believe that senior executives lied to you. I just wanted to distinguish whether you firstly understood in common with me what an accusation of lying constitutes, namely accusing a person of saying something that they believed or knew not to be true with the intention to deceive, and then secondly whether you were in fact alleging that against any particular executive.
I guess what I feel is that Post Office Limited as a body were misleading sheikhs and ministers. Who was responsible within Post Office Limited is quite difficult for me to know.
Yeah.
One assumes that it was the senior executives because they had a responsible role, and I assume were asking the questions. But I think ultimately it's for this inquiry, and I wish it well in this task of identifying who was really culpable for misleading ministers, the courts, and above all the sub-postmasters.
Thank you. So the allegation of lying applies or is intended to apply to Post Office as a corporate body, and you don't distinguish between senior executives and those who are not senior executives as to responsibility for the lie because you don't personally know.
I don't know. My only information comes from the papers that have been given to me by the inquiry and the reports of this inquiry, but I don't personally know.
Thank you very much. So it's just coming up to 1:20 now, although it's been a short session. Can we break now until 2:10?